What do you believe will be the future of the SBC regarding Southern Baptist Convention? What SBC stands for, by the way. What do you believe the future of the Southern Baptist Convention will be regarding Calvinism? And what should churches do who stand in opposition to this direction? I have no idea what the future is going to be based upon past, that they say history tends to repeat itself. And throughout history, Calvinism has resurged several times. Even Al Mohler, who is very likely going to be the next president for the SBC, who is a leading Calvinist in the SBC, and I think has single-handedly done the most within the SBC to Calvinize it, to make it more Calvinistic, because I think he has a lot of influence as to who the presidents and key leaders of the seminaries are. And the seminary presidents are often the ones, obviously, who are key in appointing professors. And so when you have a key president able to appoint their theology professors in the schools, they have a huge amount of influence. And so Southern being kind of the key biggest seminary in the SBC, he being the president of it since the early 90s, has had a lot of influence on the placement of other presidents in the other seminaries when those become vacant, become available. And so I think he has had a huge influence on the seminaries virtually becoming influenced very predominantly by Calvinistic teachers and professors. That's not to say all the seminaries only have Calvinists, but it's becoming more and more so that it seems to be a criteria to become a theology professor in a Southern Baptist seminary you have to be a Calvinist. And therefore you're churning out a lot of young Calvinist pastors who are going into churches that traditionally aren't Calvinistic, and there are splits that are taking place throughout the nation. It happens in Texas on a weekly basis, it seems, and I get word of it all over not only Texas but the world. I just got one about a message about Spain this morning, that there's splits happening in Spain because it's predominantly been a non-Calvinistic missionary work in Spain, and now all of a sudden, with John Piper and D.A. Carson's influence and several others' influence in Spain, and their libraries and things being stocked with Calvinism resources, that Calvinism is growing in Spain, and therefore there's now splitting of individual local bodies of churches that's happening pretty regularly. And so what's going to be the future? I'm not a prophet or a son of a prophet, and so I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen, but if history repeats itself, then Calvinism will surge back up and die back out again. And even Phil Johnson, I've mentioned before, predicts that Calvinism will eat itself. It'll die back out. He even talks about how hyper-Calvinism always kills Calvinism. So he says there's healthy Calvinism, because he's a Calvinist. So he says there's healthy Calvinism, and he says there's hyper-Calvinist. And he says hyper-Calvinism usually rises up and kills Calvinism. And that's the history that's repeated itself, is that Calvinism rises up, there comes a healthy Calvinism, and then hyper-Calvinism begins to take it over and then destroys it. And that's what he predicts will happen. And so my question would be, why would God ordain that? Why would God ordain for hyper-Calvinists to kill Calvinism? It just doesn't make a lot of logical sense to me. I think the reason that Calvinism dies out is because when it becomes logically consistent, i.e. hyper, that people begin to realize how silly it is and reject it. And I know that sounds demeaning and bad, but that's just my opinion about it. I guess God ordained me to have that opinion that Calvinism is not tenable. It's not a workable, realistic way of thinking logically, and it's not a biblical theology, and therefore I reject it. And I think that that's eventually what's going to happen in the SBC, is that people will begin to get more theologically savvy with how to deal with Calvinism's arguments and their interpretations. They'll begin to understand the other side of the Calvinistic arguments. They'll begin to understand what they're really saying when they're saying this and that and the other, and their interpretations, and then the alternate interpretations that are available to them. Right now, Southern Baptists, generally speaking, are pretty uneducated on the topic, whereas Calvinists generally are more educated on the topic, and therefore the average SBC churchgoer can't respond to Calvinist arguments and don't know how to respond to Calvinist arguments because they're not educated on the topic. And therefore Calvinists run over them roughshod pretty quickly because they don't know what they believe and why they believe it. Calvinists typically do, at least with regard to their tulip systematic. They know their theology pretty well, and they know the proof texts that support their verses pretty well. And therefore, they're able to talk circles around the average church-going Southern Baptist non-Calvinist. And when I say non-Calvinist, I say that they don't know what provisionism is. They don't even know what Arminianism is, most of them. And they have no real working knowledge as to how to combat the interpretive methodologies and philosophical arguments that the typical Calvinist would bring.